You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But you're just as lost as the rest of us. The words sliced through me like shards of ice. Milo's hazel eyes, so reminiscent of his mother's, bored into me with an intensity that belied his teenage angst. I was Evelyn Hartley, a social worker dedicated to keeping families together. Yet here I stood, a stranger in the Sullivan household, regarded with disdain by the very child I aimed to help. Jackson Sullivan's calloused hands gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Losing Mila, his wife and Milo's mother, had crushed his spirit. The light in his deep brown eyes had dimmed, overshadowed by anguish and the overwhelming responsibility of raising a rebellious teen alone. "Milo, that's enough," Jackson warned, his voice a weary rasp. "Miss Hartley is here to support us, whether you like it or not." Milo scoffed, snatching his backpack from the floor. "Yeah, just like all the other supporters who couldn't care less about us." As the front door slammed, Jackson buried his face in his hands. I ached to provide reassurance, to explain that confronting pain was the only path to healing. But how could I, an outsider, grasp the depths of their loss? "I'm sorry, Miss Hartley," Jackson mumbled, lifting his gaze to meet mine. "He's been different since Mila. Since the accident. I've tried everything, but he just keeps pulling away." Placing a gentle hand on his arm, I replied, "You have nothing to apologize for, Jackson. Grief manifests differently in everyone, especially the young." I paused, weighing my next words carefully. "Have you considered counseling for Milo? Sometimes an outside perspective can." "No." The outburst left Jackson's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. "I won't have strangers poking around in my son's head, telling him how to deal with his pain. We'll get through this as a family, like we always have." His conviction was admirable, but misguided. I recognized the desperation clouding his judgment, the burning need to regain control in the face of shattering loss. Persisting would only breed further resentment. "Of course," I said with a sympathetic smile. "Why don't you tell me more about Milo? The more I understand him, the better I can support you both through this transition." Yielding a shaky exhale, Jackson's shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. "He's a good kid at heart, you know? Smart, talented, with the ability to light up any room." As the words tumbled from Jackson's lips, I recognized the flicker of hope smoldering within him. It was my job to fan those feeble embers, to help this fractured family find their way through the darkness, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, I became a fixture in the Sullivan household. Despite Milo's open hostility, Jackson clung to me like a lifeline, desperate for any semblance of stability. My role evolved from caseworker to family counselor to willing ear for his rambling reminiscences about Mila. "She had this contagious laughter, you know?" Jackson's eyes would mist over during these moments. "It could brighten even the darkest of days." I'd smile and nod, allowing the memories to cocoon him, if only temporarily. Milo, however, remained stubbornly recalcitrant. Sullen glares and biting remarks became his calling cards whenever I was present. My attempts at friendly conversation were rebuffed with little more than grunts or eye rolls. "He'll come around," Jackson assured me after particularly volatile outbursts. "Just give him time." But as the weeks dragged on, Milo's behavior grew increasingly erratic and troubling. There were the unexplained late nights, the furtive phone calls, a peculiar shift in his friend group. I finally mustered the courage to voice my concerns. Jackson's was dismissive. "Teenagers, right?" He chuckled humorlessly. "I was no angel at his age either. It's just a phase. He'll outgrow it." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something bigger. The signs were there, practically flashing like neon billboards, but Jackson's desperation to believe in his son rendered him blind. Then came the fateful night that shattered all remaining illusions. "Where have you been?" Jackson's voice thundered through the house as I entered. In the foyer, he gripped Milo's arm with an almost frantic intensity. Milo jerked away, his jaw set in that infuriatingly smug way of his. "Out, it's no big deal." "No big deal?" Jackson sputtered. "You reek of alcohol, Milo, and what's that?" He snatched a crumpled bag from Milo's pants pocket, his face contorting with rage and fear as he glimpsed the contents. "Pills? My God, what have you gotten yourself into?" In that explosive moment, the truth struck me with brutal clarity. Milo's misbehavior went far beyond teenage rebellion. It was a desperate cry to extinguish the anguish devouring him from within. Jackson raised his hand as if to strike his son, but I caught his wrist firmly. "Stop, this won't solve anything." His arm went limp in my grasp, the pent-up anger and grief finally cresting in heart-wrenching sobs. As I pulled him into an embrace, Milo slipped away, disappearing up the stairs without a shred of remorse. In that moment, the fragile foundation we'd built began to crumble. I could only pray we'd find a way to rebuild before tragedy struck again. In the aftermath of that explosive night, an uneasy silence blanketed the Sullivan home. Jackson retreated into himself, grappling with the harsh reality that his son's downward spiral was more than typical teenage angst. I, too, found myself at a loss. My training had equipped me to handle crisis situations, but nothing could have prepared me for the gut punch of Milo's self-destructive behavior. What demons tormented him to seek such reckless solace? He avoided me like the plague in those tense days, slinking around the house with resentful scowls whenever our paths crossed. Until one afternoon I stumbled upon him in the backyard, hunched under the oak tree with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. "Milo," I ventured cautiously, "are you all right?" A mirthless chuckle escaped his chapped lips. "Does it look like I'm all right, Evelyn?" It was the first time he'd used my first name, void of the customary venom. An invitation, perhaps, to break through his painstakingly erected walls. Lowering myself beside him, I searched for the right words that could pry open the Pandora's box of turmoil he'd bottled within. "Help me understand what you're going through," I said at last. "Why are you so determined to punish yourself? And your father?" Silence stretched between us, heavy and interminable. Then a whisper, barely audible, "Because I killed her." My breath caught in my throat as Milo raised his haunted gaze to meet mine. The accident, it was my fault. All of it. Piece by piece the fragments spilled forth. Milo's painful confession of the clandestine party he'd attended that fateful night, the reckless overconsumption, the attempt to cover his tracks by taking his mother's car without permission. By the time his ragged voice cracked on the image of swinging headlights and his mother's surprised gasp, I felt my heart shredding within my chest. "Your mother's death was a horrible tragedy, Milo," I managed, struggling to maintain my composure. "But you didn't kill her. You're just a child. No child should ever have to carry that burden." Milo barked out a hollow laugh, swiping angrily at the tears streaking his flushed cheeks. "Right, because taking her car without permission and getting blasted on booze and God knows what else had nothing to do with it." "What you've been through is unimaginable," I pressed on, desperate to absolve him of the guilt ravaging his soul. "But your mother wouldn't want this for you. She'd want you to live, Milo, to embrace the wonderful life she sacrificed everything for." For an eternal moment, Milo's piercing gaze bored into me as if he could dissect every encrypted meaning behind my words. Then, without warning, he lurched to his feet and stalked away, leaving me alone with the ghosts of the tragic revelation that had unraveled between us. In the days following Milo's shattering confession, a pall hung over the Sullivan household. Jackson remained holed up in his bedroom, no doubt grappling with the devastating knowledge of his son's guilt and self-loathing. As for me, I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid that any misstep might trigger another explosive outburst. Milo, for his part, oscillated between stony silence and volcanic rages, lashing out at any perceived slight or attempt to discuss his emotional turmoil. I began dreading the sound of his footsteps pounding up the stairs or the thunderous slam of his bedroom door. Jarring reminders of the fragility gripping this fractured family. It was during one of his absences, with Jackson mercifully at work, that I stumbled across the damning evidence in his room. A battered shoebox tucked under his bed, brimming with miniature baggies emblazoned with cannabis leaves and indecipherable markings. My hands turned clammy as I rifled through the grim contents, each plastic pouch a harbinger of lives derailed by addiction's merciless claws. How could we have let it spiral this far? The front door's unceremonious slam jolted me back to reality. I barely had time to shove the harrowing box aside before Milo's hulking form filled the bedroom doorway. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he snarled, eyes wild and lips curled into a sneer so feral it stole the breath from my lungs. I straightened my spine, forcing strength into my voice I didn't quite feel. We need to talk, Milo. This. I gestured vaguely at the box. It has to stop, for your own sake. A cruel bark of laughter burst from his lips as he strode fully into the room, leaning down to snatch the box and thrust its contents directly under my nose. You mean this? This is just the tip of the iceberg, lady. Revulsion curdled in my stomach at his nonchalance, his flagrant disregard for the danger he was courting. This wasn't the despondent grief of a lost young man. It was the foolish bravado of someone teetering on the edge of catastrophic choices with no sense of consequence. If you don't get help, I said, each word leadin' on my tongue, I'll have no choice but to recommend alternative treatment options. Milo's eyes glittered with calculating menace as he slowly rose to his full height, towering over me in a menacing spectacle. You'll do no such thing, he hissed through clenched teeth. This is my life, not yours. You don't get to make those decisions. But I do. The new voice sliced through the tension like a scythe. Jackson stood framed in the doorway, his expression an inscrutable mask as he appraised the damning scene before him. Dad, Milo began, the veneer of bravado cracking, but Jackson raised a hand, silencing him. His next words cleaved through the air with implacable finality. You're going away, son, to a treatment center where you can get the help you so desperately need. It's the only way. The roar that issued from Milo's lips will be forever seared into my memory, a primal sound of anguished defiance that chilled my blood. As he raged and Jackson stood steadfastly resolute, I couldn't escape the sinking feeling that this family had reached its point of no return. In the aftermath of Jackson's ultimatum, an uneasy truce settled over the Sullivan home. Milo seethed in sullen silence, only emerging from his bedroom to stalk the halls with thunderous footfalls. While Jackson maintained an outward facade of stoic resolve, I could see the cracks beginning to form, the slight tremble in his hands, the perpetual tightness around his eyes. As for me, I found myself caught in the crosshairs, desperately trying to broker peace while upholding Jackson's edict. Navigating the minefield of their strained father-son dynamic was utterly draining. He'll come around, Jackson would assure me during our hushed conversations, his voice betraying the slightest waver of doubt. Once he gets the help he needs, things will get better. They have to. I wanted to share his hope, to believe that the darkness enveloping the Sullivans was merely a hurdle to be vaulted. But Milo's rage seemed to have metastasized into an insidious, all-consuming force. The breaking point came one night after a particularly volatile screaming match between father and son. Milo had swept a plateful of food across the kitchen in a blinding fury, leaving Jackson reeling and me attempting to placate them both. When the dust settled and Milo stormed off, Jackson slumped against the counter, his shoulders quaking with barely restrained sobs. I can't do this anymore, Evelyn, he rasped, anguish contorting his features. I've tried so hard to keep it together, but he's shutting me out at every turn. Maybe sending him away is the only answer. My heart clenched at the naked vulnerability in his words. So focused had I been on Milo's turmoil, I'd neglected the toll this was taking on the man I'd grown unexpectedly attached to. With a trembling hand, I reached out and gently grasped his arm. You're not alone, Jackson, I murmured. We'll get through this together. A flicker of something I couldn't quite identify passed over his face as his calloused fingers brushed across my knuckles. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his broad shoulders. Then, like a bucket of ice water, reality came crashing back down. My phone trilled shrilly from my bag, shattering the fragile stillness. Reluctantly releasing Jackson's hand, I fished it out to see the dreaded name flashing across the screen. Hartley, I answered tautly. The voice on the other end was clipped. All business. There's been an incident at the shelter, a disagreement that got physical. Your expertise is needed to defuse the situation. Of course. In the emotional whirlwind of the Sullivan crisis, I'd nearly forgotten I had an entire other life teetering on the precipice, filled with its own demands and broken souls in need of guidance. Glancing back at Jackson's ashen features, I was struck by the guilt of being pulled in two drastically opposing directions. I'm on my way, I replied automatically, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. Jackson managed a strained approximation of a smile as I gathered my things. Go, he rasped. We'll be all right for one night. His hollow assurance did little to ease the leaden weight in my chest as I rushed out the door. For all my determination to untangle the Sullivans' anguish, I couldn't seem to catch my own bearings, and in that moment the certainty of failure loomed larger than I could have ever imagined. The annual Willow Grove Charity Gala was usually a highlight for me, a chance to bring awareness and donor dollars to the various social initiatives I championed. But this year, as I stood surrounded by the city's elite in their opulent finery, I felt utterly adrift. Jackson and Milo were conspicuously absent, of course. In the weeks since Jackson's decision to pursue treatment for his son, an impenetrable chasm had formed between us. My endless efforts to reassure him he was doing the right thing felt like shouting into an endless void. "You don't understand what this is doing to him," Jackson had said during one heated exchange, his voice edged with barely restrained anguish. "He's not just some case number, Evelyn. He's my son." I wanted to believe I could relate, that my own turbulent upbringing had equipped me with the emotional bandwidth to empathize. But the truth was, I couldn't fathom the agonizing choice he'd been forced to make. So tonight, as I plastered on a benign smile and worked the room of potential donors, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I was losing my grip on the Sullivans. That all my reassurances and support were simply delaying the inevitable fracture in their fragile family dynamic. It was during my welcoming speech that the dam finally broke. What a crock of lies! The venomous words sliced through the murmured titters of the crowd like a whip. All eyes swiveled toward the commotion at the back of the hall, where a tiny part in the sea of bodies revealed the sneering face of Milo, I stammered, the blood draining from my face. He shoved his way through the throngs of gawking patrons, eyes blazing with an emotion too volatile to comfortably name. "This whole shindig is a sham," he declared, his voice booming with unchecked rage. "Just like everything else about this two-faced, money-grubbing shrew." A strangled gasp escaped my lips as the reality of his tirade set in. "Milo, please, you're not thinking clearly." "Oh, but I've never seen more clearly." He rounded on me with unsettling intensity. "How many lives have you ruined, Evelyn? How many families ripped apart, all in the name of your savior complex?" Somewhere in the crowd, Jackson's stricken face materialized. A macabre vision leached of all color and vitality. In his eyes, I saw the final shreds of faith in me, in us, crumbling to ash. "My father trusted you." Milo's fists were clenched so tightly, his knuckles shone like polished marble. "He let you manipulate us into sending me away because you couldn't stand to see a life you couldn't control." Stunned silence hung like a shroud over the hall. All around, faces etched in shock and revulsion bore into me with accusation. Distantly, I was aware of Jackson trying to shout over the roar of my pulse thundering in my ears. Then, like a vaporous dream, reality shifted once more. "Well, well, well." The familiar, silken drawl cut through the tension like a scythe. If it isn't little Evelyn Hartley herself, always ready to swoop in and play the long-suffering martyr. My entire body went rigid as unmistakable footfalls echoed across the stage. A figure emerged from the wings, bestowing the crowd with a thin, razor-edged smile. Renee Caldwell. The mentor whose manipulative tendrils had shaped every aspect of my career, only to turn maniacally bitter upon my rise in prominence. What fresh torment did this vile woman have in store? As Renee draped a spindly arm around Milo's shoulders, her serpentine gaze pierced straight through me. "Didn't I warn you, Evelyn?" she purred, each word a barbed weapon. "Those who can't control their own demons shouldn't dare try saving others." The days following the gala descended into a waking nightmare. Whispers and furtive glances dogged my every step as the vicious accusations leveled by Milo and Renee metastasized through the community like a malignant cancer. "I had no idea you were so manipulative, Evelyn. To think we trusted you with our most vulnerable families. I always suspected there was something off about you." The judgmental murmurs pursued me relentlessly until I began questioning my own reality. Had I truly been so blind to Renee's toxic influence all those years? Had her poisonous mentorship irrevocably warped me into the heartless operative Milo portrayed? Jackson, for his part, had gone utterly silent, a looming void where my confidant and friend had once resided. His refusal to engage, to offer any hint of whether he still believed in me, opened a yawning chasm of uncertainty that threatened to swallow me whole. It was only through clawing desperation that I finally found my lifeline in the most unlikely of sources. Francine Batista, mother of one of my longest-running cases and a recipient of the community's gossiping scorn. "Don't let that little bitch grind you down," she said without preamble when I arrived on her doorstep, red-rimmed eyes betraying innumerable shed tears. "She's been gunning for you since day one." "You know about Renee?" I asked, startled. A harsh bark of Lar escaped Francine's lips as she ushered me inside, the harsh scent of stale cigarette smoke overwhelming. "That spiteful has-been? Afraid so, honey. Been trying to drag you down for years, just waiting for the right insecure kid to latch onto." She fixed me with an appraising look over the rim of her beer can. "Word on the street is this latest thing with the Sullivan brat was her golden ticket." The implications of her words sliced through the fog of self-doubt like a scalpel. Of course, Milo's accusations, Renee's impeccably timed appearance, it had all been an intricately orchestrated ploy to dismantle my life's work, to seize the reins of the charitable empire I'd so painstakingly built. But why? The question slipped out in a hoarse croak. "What could she possibly gain by tormenting an old colleague?" Francine snorted indelicately. "Ain't about you, sweetie. It's about power. Envy's an ugly beast, and your success was a lash against that crone's swollen ego one too many times." Gritting my teeth, I tamped down the swell of fury burning in my chest. Francine was right. I'd been played for a fool, willingly stumbling into the viper's snare while paralyzed by self-incrimination. But no more. "I need to find Renee," I declared, surging to my feet with a renewed sense of purpose. "And I need to make her admit to every last manipulation. It's the only way I'll be able to clear my name and have a prayer of making things right with the Sullivans." A thin smile curved Francine's lips. "Need any help tracking down that twisted bitch? You know I got connects all over this city." Relief washed over me as I realized I didn't have to wage this battle alone. Not if I had the allies to expose Renee's lies for what they truly were. "You're on," I replied, conviction flooding my veins. It's time to stop cowering from that demon's toxic shadow, once and for all. It didn't take long for Francine's street contacts to lead me straight to Renee's latest lair, a dilapidated community center on the city's outskirts. My footsteps echoed ominously as I strode through the grime-caked hallways, bracing for the inevitable confrontation. Well, if it isn't the noble Evelyn Hartley herself. Renee's mocking words sliced through the stale air like a blade as I entered the decrepit recreation room. "To what do I owe this? Pleasure?" She sneered the last word, lips curled back over yellowed teeth in a regrettable semblance of a smile. A handful of downtrodden individuals lingered nearby, no doubt the latest recruits ensnared in her twisted vision. "Cut the act, Renee," I bit out, fists clenched at my sides. "We both know why I'm here." A rasping chuckle rattled from her skeletal frame. "Do we now? Because if I'm not mistaken, you've rather spectacularly run your charitable juggernaut into the ground." Her smile twisted into something sadistically gleeful. "All thanks to a few well-planted seeds of doubt, courtesy of your latest stray." White-hot rage lanced through me at the mention of Milo's unwitting role in her schemes. "You manipulated that boy's grief and anger for your own selfish gain, just like you've manipulated everyone around you for decades." Renee's eyes glittered with undisguised malice as she rose to her full, unimpressive height. "Oh, but poor little Milo was all too willing to be molded, my dear. Such a delightfully malleable mind once I revealed how you've been using his family's tragedy to boost your moral superiority complex." "That's a lie," I cried, taking an involuntary step forward. "Everything I've done has been to help them heal." "To help them?" Renee cackled derisively. "Don't be so arrogantly naive, you self-righteous idiot. You inserted yourself into their lives to fill the void left by your own tarnished childhood. Just like you always do when you play the martyr for these whimpering wretches." Her bony finger jabbed accusingly toward the cluster of derelicts gaping at our exchange with blank incomprehension. "They all fawn over you, blinded by your convincing savior act. But I know the truth. You're as broken and starved for purpose as the rest of them. More so, even." I opened my mouth, a torrent of furious denials bubbling forth, but Renee plowed ruthlessly onward. That's why you were so easy to manipulate into this downfall, she purred, that insidious smile stretching once more. Because despite your grandstanding delusions of atonement, you're still just a sad little girl desperate for acceptance. And now, thanks to the cracks I've shattered in your pristine reputation, you'll never escape that stark reality. In that moment, something inside me shifted, a uproarial calm settling over the roiling tempest of indignation. Because for all her blistering condemnations, Renee's words rang utterly hollow. A smokescreen to camouflage the twisted machinations that had brought us to this juncture. You're right, I murmured, holding her startled gaze steadily. I don't have all the answers. I've made mistakes in helping the Sullivans, just like I have with countless others over the years. A muscle jumped in Renee's jaw, but I pressed onward before she could interrupt. But those missteps came from a place of earnest caring, something you've never been capable of understanding. All you recognize is jealousy and spite for those who overcome their own brokenness to find purpose. The barb struck home, her sallow features contorting grotesquely. You arrogant, self-deluded bitch. I'll destroy everything you've built, do you hear me? You'll be left with nothing. No, Renee? I shook my head slowly, faint traces of pity warring with the overwhelming sense of release. I may have stumbled, but I've never been nothing. Not like you. With a primal screech of outrage, Renee lunged toward me, all pretenses of composure evaporating. But before her gnarled fingers could so much as graze me, a chorus of shouts erupted from the sidelines. Suddenly, I was surrounded by the very same derelicts who'd been passively observing. Their vacant expressions hardened into grim determination as they subdued my unraveling tormentor. It was over. The dominance of Renee's toxic reign had drawn its last, wheezing breath. As the cacophony of shock and anger swirled around me, a singular thought blossomed in my mind's eye. The Sullivans. My path toward making amends beckoned, if they'd allow me the chance to try again.